Does lowering demands for a PDA child or teen in the home enable bad habits and set them up for failure, or does it support their well-being, learning, and mental health over the long term? Today we're going to talk about and go back to the basics of lowering demands for a PDA child or teen. We're going to do 5 things today together. I'm going to tell you a brief anecdote or story about this morning to give you an example of how I lower demands in my home still. 2, I'm going to talk about the theory of change and why lowering demands can be supportive over the long term for your family. I'm going to give you a definition of what I mean by lowered demands. And then we're going to talk about the 3 primary places that I see parents that I work with get stuck with lowering demands. And then finally, for those of you who are more advanced in the journey and maybe have already been lowering demands for a while, we'll talk about a couple nuances and why you may not be making the progress or the level of transformation in the home that you want. Okay? So welcome everybody. I'm going to start with the story. So this is a very simple story. My son Cooper is 9 and he has been out of burnout now for about 3 years. So this story illustrates how we still lower demands in the household so that he can go to school, so that he can participate in tackle football, so that he can actually learn. So last year, we had a lot of trouble with homework. Okay, so while he would do great in school, he would not only resist the homework, but he would also fixate on needing to do the homework because the other kids were doing it. And so he would get into these cognitive loops where he would escalate and we would say, hey, bud, you don't need to do the homework. It's okay. We've talked to the teachers, but then he would get fixated on needing to do it. So it wasn't as simple as just lowering the demand and giving him autonomy of like, you don't have to do it, because he would fixate on doing it. So one of the ways that we would lower the demand of the homework for him is that we figured out one of the sticking points, which was actually the act of writing, right? And so he could do a lot of the math in his head or on the paper, but then if he had to write things out about it, he would just start to escalate. And the same thing was true for his vocabulary homework. And so one of the things that we do in a fluctuating capacity, depending on how much nervous system activation there is that we will step in and write the answers for him, right? And so this seems really counterintuitive. And I also understand that many teachers are like, no, they need practice writing and they need practice with their homework, with their handwriting, right? However, the skill that he was working on was math or coming up with a storyline. And so this morning, during my meditation and my morning routine, my son came up and he was like resisting homework. And I was like, hey, bud, let's talk about it together. Let's share the demand. And I waited until he felt that he could no longer write, because there was a description part of like, come up with a job description for a shepherd. And he used all the vocabulary verbally that he was practicing. He understood how to use the vocabulary words. He wrote the first sentence, and then I wrote the rest of it while he dictated to me. Okay, so I lowered the demand of the writing so that he could access the learning. Okay, so this is a very counterintuitive logic for parents, for teachers, for therapists, for doctors, right? And I want to talk a little bit about why that is, to get into the theory of change for neurotypical or anxious or OCD kids versus the logic of the brain and nervous system of the PDA kid, because I firmly believe that the conventional wisdom isn't wrong per se, and that the approaches that most people take in therapy, education, and parenting are not wrong. They're just a different lens and logic that most of the time don't support our unique children who have a different way of sensing and perceiving the world and threat. Okay? So the conventional wisdom and the conventional logic and a lot of the evidence is based on the idea that for children to learn skills and habits and behaviors that are appropriate, they need practice with them, and we need to sort of push them to do the thing so that they will get, quote, used to it. This is like a subtle form of exposure. For example, if they're anxious about it, then they can be gently pushed through it so they don't sort of fixate on that fear if it's something that, they're avoiding because of anxiety, right? And so this is premised on the idea that, like all parents, we want them to be independent. We want them to have skills. We want them to succeed in life. And underneath that is love, right? There is nothing wrong with this approach. But what happens with a PDA child or teen? Every time we're pushing them to do something that their nervous system can't tolerate, we are pushing them into their survival brain and into their nervous system. And then they're in the part of the brain where they actually can't think, they can't access information, they can't access the skills that they already have. And they're actually having like a panic response, either to a perception of danger, and if we push, it can escalate to a perception of life threat. So this is when we see fight, flight, freeze, fawn, or shutdown, which are nervous system responses. Okay, so remembering that the logic of PDA is that every time there is a neuroception, which means subconscious perception of me as the parent being above them, telling them to do something, or the expectation, like these are the chores that we do each day, or a loss of autonomy, meaning there's not true choice about something, then there is that ping to their survival brain that's like, hey, there's a lion in front of you. Hey, metabolism and adrenaline and cortisol and muscles react to that, right? So it's not something that's under their conscious control. But the fight flight is when we're seeing that avoidance play out, sometimes in an aggressive way. And so what can we do about this to support our children with the same goal that parents of neurotypical children and anxious children and spirited children, highly sensitive children have, which is like, we love our kids, we want them to be independent, we want them to eventually learn skills, and we want them to be successful. So with PDA kids, what often happens is that we're approaching them with the conventional wisdom of like, I need to keep making them do chores. I need to keep making them read every day. I need to force my kid to write because the teacher said he needs practice with handwriting. So if I write it for him, then he's not getting that practice and he'll never succeed. Okay? However, what we want to start thinking about is a different goal, which is how can I support my PDA child to the extent possible to spend as much time in the thinking brain as possible and develop a window of tolerance, meaning they're never going to have no demands and they're never going to have no losses of autonomy and equality, because that's not life. That's not life in a family system. That's not life in the human world. And PDAers also have internal losses of autonomy and demands. So the goal is not never to have demands or never to have losses of autonomy. It is to have in accumulation not 10 out of 10 demands or 9 out of 10 demands, but 8 out of the 10 we're saying, okay, I can lower that demand so they stay below their threshold being where they go into that fight, flight, freeze, or shut down. And every time I lower demand, I can increase that window, right? So then when we actually have to have a demand, like, taking a medication or being safe around a sibling, they'll still activate because that's how their brain and neuroception works, but they won't be tipping over into the point where they're being disabled from accessing basic needs and, unsafe and constantly in that survival brain. So the logic of lowering demands is actually the more I lower demands for my child, the more they stay in their thinking brain where they can actually learn, access skills they might already have, like writing, for example, and have that relationship with you so that you can facilitate learning, okay? What's difficult about this process is that developing that window and that different relational interaction between you and helping them like continually get back in their thinking brain is that it takes repetition and practice and time, just like anything else, right? So like, it's not I lower this demand and then they'll do their homework, right? It's creating a window in accumulation. And so this is the logic where in the moment, I lowered the demand of writing so that my son could stay in his thinking brain and still access the learning about the vocabulary. If I had pushed it, he would have gone right into his survival brain, and in the name of making him write, he would have not learned the lesson of the vocabulary, and he would have probably resisted both homework the next day and had a nervous system impact that made other things more difficult, like staying safe at school, eating, sleeping, right? So it's all in accumulation, and the causality can seem indirect, but it's all related to more important things than writing, like whether or not he can eat, okay? So how do we define lowering demands? Like a lot of people talk about low demand lifestyle and, lowering demands for a PDA or neurodivergent child. And I think it can sometimes get conflated with giving children to true choice, right? So this is how I first thought about it. Like, okay, I'm not going to have my kid come with me to the grocery store because that's too much of a demand. Or, I'm going to lower the demand by not putting him in after school activities. But really that wasn't giving him the autonomy or the dopamine and novelty that he needed, which was like, instead of me being like, I'm not going to sign you up for any activities because I need to lower the demands, the autonomy piece was more like, I can sign you up for whatever you want and we can go as an offering, like this is an offering, and you can go to karate when your body can do it versus, when you feel like you can't, right? Because completely lowering demands doesn't necessarily get that child the novelty, dopamine, and sensory intense experiences that they benefit from in terms of their nervous system. So what I have come to define as lowering demands is the following: doing things for a child or teen that they could physically do for themselves and that seem developmentally appropriate for that age group. Okay? So, let me give you a bunch of examples of these. Let's start with bringing food. And these are all things that I still do in my home, even though my son is well out of burnout. He's thriving as the best version of himself, but I'm always thinking through the logic of keeping a window, keeping our relationship, and helping strengthen those neural pathways back to the thinking brain so that I'm not overtaxing his system so that he wouldn't be able to access school and tackle football and friendships. Okay? So one thing, bringing food. I bring my son his food, or my husband does it, or our au pair does it. What does that mean? He sits on the couch and he's like, I need water. I need popcorn. I'm hungry, right? And so I lower the demand of first executive functioning. I don't ask him what he wants, right? Because that's the demand of him having to think of it. I'm like, okay, I can come up with a buffet, or I can offer him some ideas using declarative language. I might say, I can get you apples, I can cut up some bread with honey, and I can get some Cheetos. And then he might be like, Cheetos and apples. I've also lowered the demand about the way he speaks to me. He doesn't say please and thank you, and sometimes it comes off as rude. But I know that the demand of being polite in the moment when he needs to eat is not worth it because he has a history of really restricted eating. So I bring the food over and he eats, right? And then I take his plate away. And yes, I do sometimes feel like a maid. And yes, it's annoying. However, the cost to his nervous system of me not doing that would be potentially not eating as much as he does now, and he's expanding his food, and maybe impacting his school access, right? So I view these all as causally related because it's in accumulation. I also help him with a shower, for example. So where we started was like refusal of showers, okay? And we've made immense progress. Now it is, hey bud, declarative language, I can start the shower for you. I lower the demand of setting up the shower, bringing the towels in, grabbing his clothes from outside, turning it on, checking the temperature. I shut the door, he does his shower, and then he runs through the kitchen and he throws his towel and his clothes, and I pick them up and I put them in the hamper. He's almost 10. He is absolutely capable cognitively and physically of doing all of these things by himself. However, I am choosing with my agency to apply the accommodation of lower demand so that he can access things that I think are more important for him, knowing that the larger the window, the more capacity over the long term he has to actually do things and learn things. So I want to also highlight the progress. We don't have battles around hygiene. I don't need to be in the bathroom as a safe nervous system monitoring him, and he physically gets his clothes on by himself, okay? So those all used to be demands that I would have to lower earlier in our progress and his development, right? And then so there's other things that are fluctuating, right? Remembering that this is cumulative. Maybe the first 4 days of the week, he brushes his teeth, no big deal. But by the end of the week of school and football practice, he's physically, mentally exhausted, and the window is getting smaller, right? Like the window of tolerance is getting smaller because all those losses of autonomy, the demands, and the losses of equality are building up in his nervous system. So I might lower the demand of showering altogether. I might lower the demand or give autonomy around, because sometimes he wants to, of brushing his teeth. Or I might say, I can brush your teeth for you. I might bring in a cup of water, make it silly, bring in a cup of water, bring in the toothbrush with the toothpaste, another cup to spit in, and make it a whole thing of I'm coming in to deliver him the capacity to brush his teeth. And it's not like if I could push and say, bud, you're fine, brush your teeth. And it's not to say there are never instances when I don't lower the demand. However, I'm constantly making a cost-benefit calculation in my head, which is actually something that I believe we're modeling for our children so that when they are adults, they can do this for themselves, of lower the demands on themselves so that they can have success and joy in life. Because sometimes, whether or not you're neurotypical or neurodivergent, sometimes it's just too much to brush your teeth and floss them at night, right? Let's just be honest. Adults do this too. Another example that has improved immensely, but still is an example of lowering a demand, is moving from the car to the house, right? So if you have a child who's neurotypical or maybe not PDA, the expectation is that when they're going from the car to the home, they will grab their stuff and they will carry it into the house, whether it's their backpack, whether it's the trash from eating at McDonald's or whatever it is, their water bottle. But this is not something that I expect my kids to do. I carry it for them, right? And that is a lower demand because I'm doing something for the child or teen that they could do physically for themselves. And this has also been immense progress. When my son was in or coming out of burnout, I would be so stressed just moving between the car and the house, which would be in my driveway, because if I didn't reach the house to like mitigate between the siblings and make sure everyone was like safely on a screen or playing separate from each other, it was like there would be absolute chaos and there would be people getting hurt and things getting broken. So then I would, once everyone was settled, have to go back and get all the stuff. And it would be like if I was separating my nervous system from my PDA, or for even that 1 minute to get the stuff in the house, there would be an escalation and I would worry about equalizing against my younger son. Now we've made a ton of progress, right? They often carry 1 or 2 things, like their iPads, and then I carry the rest. But I can also, because the nervous system has come down from such a baseline of threat and past the threshold, my son can wait for me for 2 minutes while I gather up the things, okay? So progress is slow, but it is consistent. And this impacts everything else in their life that you want them to succeed at, right? People are like, how do I make my child sleep? How do I make my child eat? How do I make them go to school? All this stuff, right? They're focusing on these big outcomes. And I understand that because you're worried and they have things that are looking like medical issues and they're refusing school and you have to work and it's terrifying. And I've been through it. But the honest truth is that lowering demands and giving autonomy on things that don't seem like they have anything to do with school or eating or sleeping or toileting are actually causally related. Okay, so the more we lower demands as an accommodation, the more they have a window of tolerance and are able to access the things that we as parents are looking at in isolation. Okay, so this is a mindset shift, but it's a very, very important one. Okay, 4. Where do parents get stuck with this? Okay, so I've worked with over 1,000 parents now, all of whom believe that their PDA child or teen is PDA. So I have a very large N sample, meaning we can notice patterns and where parents get stuck. The first place that parents get stuck is on what I spoke about at the beginning of this live, which is the logic. Right? They're still reverting to the logic of neurotypical kids or non-PDA neurodivergent kids, which is I need to teach a skill and I need to make them do the thing so that they'll get used to it and develop a habit. And if I don't do that, then they'll never do it. Okay? Versus I need to actually give them autonomy around whether or not they do this, because that is widening their window of tolerance. I'm going to lower the demands, even if they can physically do it themselves, so that they stay in their thinking brain and can learn, so that they can access the skills they already have, and so that we're, over the long term, helping them stay in their thinking brain so that they can actually, over the long term, learn to be independent and use skills, okay? And that's a lot to wrap your mind around right there, right? Like a lot of parents, like we don't even need to continue. That's where they get stuck. And that's okay. Like it takes time to wrap our minds around a different logic. Again, pointing out there is nothing wrong with a different logic, the one that is conventional parenting. I'm not saying other people are wrong. I'm saying there are different ways to approach different brains. Okay? The second, even if parents do understand the logic, or teachers or therapists, and even if they can cognitively say, Casey, like this makes sense. I agree. I know it. I've lived it. Like I see it in my home or in my clinic or in my classroom. The conditioning and the emotions around what it means to go against the conventional wisdom are often what prevents the implementation of lowering demands. It is the moment when you are delivering food to your child who is on an iPad barking at you from the couch that your little inner voice is like, you are setting them up to be abusive. Like you want to raise a nice man as an adult and yet you're acting like they're made. Or maybe you're on board and your inner voice isn't so harsh, but then you have a partner who's like, this is the wrong thing to do. Like, you're just creating a monster, or you're rewarding bad behavior, or you have an in-law, or you have all of them, right? And often it's not just one person. And why? Because there is a societal conventional wisdom that says human behavior works in a certain way, right? And the underlying assumption is that behavior is under the conscious control of the person, whether or not they're a child, and we need to disincentivize or incentivize them to be good, right? There's an underlying assumption but below that, which is like humans need to be controlled, where they're not inherently good. We need to give them rules and incentives and structures so that they don't become not good, or like continue to be their not good human selves. But what if we could start with the premise of like, my child is already good. They just can't access it because all we see is their threat response. And actually, they may already have a lot of skills. We don't need to teach them. We just need to bring down the threat response so they can access them. And by the way, once we get them into their thinking brain, then they can actually demonstrate that they want to learn and they want to contribute and that they want to be part of a family. And it's trusting that, and it's really hard. It goes against how many of us think about humans, okay? So this is deep, deep conditioning and deep, if you're a professional, you're going to see evidence-based studies that are going to go against this, but always remembering that is, the findings of studies are from the middle of the distribution, right? In a large sample. And our children, the PDAers, are the outliers. And so it doesn't mean that the study is wrong. It just means that the average is not our child. And so the average findings might not apply, okay? And in the ABA literature, it's not 100% effective. It's like, okay, 60% effective in this age group. What about the other 40%? Those are our kids, right? And so we need to be more critical in our thinking, and we're not turkeys, as my business coach says. Parents are not turkeys. Like, we're not stupid. Okay. Finally, the third and very real place that parents get stuck is the trade-off that comes with lowering demands, meaning you're physically doing things for your child that they cannot do for themselves, okay? There's a very real trade-off. It's energetic, it's physical, it's time. And this is when we want to start shifting ourselves into the mindset of this is a nervous system disability. In accumulation, over time, nervous system activation around repeated losses of autonomy and equality will begin to, you're not a turkey, we're not turkeys, will disable our children from first their things they need to stay alive: toileting, sleeping, eating, hygiene, and or safety. And then on a second level, their activities of daily living like movement, leaving the house, accessing school, okay? And this is why I continually say this is a disability. It may be fluctuating and it may be invisible sometimes, but it is a disability. And so part of this lowering demands where we have our resistance is because we're still in the parenting mindset. Instead of, I'm actually a caregiver, especially if my kid's in burnout. I am caregiving for them, not just parenting. And that is a different thing, okay? And so starting to embrace that and have some compassion for yourself is the first step towards sort of getting unstuck with going deep with lowering demands. Okay, finally, the fifth thing I want to talk about quickly is just 3 nuances or insights for parents who are further along in their journey with lowering demands and not finding like they're making the progress that they want. Okay, so I feel like for truly transforming the home, finding peace, and helping our PDAers thrive as the best versions of themselves, it is like peeling back layers of an onion, right? We get to a certain place and then we plateau and then we go deeper, right? So this is for those of you who feel like you're at a plateau or you're not finding that the lowering demands is working, quote, working to get you to where you want to be. Okay, so the first gentle seed that I want to plant is, I see parents get stuck, and I understand this because I've done the same thing with using lowered demands in order to get the child or teen to do something, or being attached to, I'm going to lower these demands so that this outcome occurs. Okay, totally normal to do that. It's something to be aware of, because the energy you have around using an accommodation in order to get a specified outcome, like I'm going to lower demands for 2 weeks so that my kid goes back to school, or I'm going to lower the demand of, bringing my child food so that they start eating more, right? And that's, of course, what we're initially going to be thinking and wanting. But if you want to go a level deeper, it is you like looking at the demand as an accommodation, not a behavioral strategy. Okay, and this is nuanced. And there's no judgment here. This is just to help you go deeper if you so choose. So what does that look like? I am going to, in the spirit of wanting to support access to eating, I'm going to lower the demands around eating. And it may always be like this. And maybe it's not me who delivers food to my son when he's 30, but hopefully I'll be able to hire a caregiver. That's the mindset that I'm in. It doesn't mean things aren't improving, but there is a degree of letting go and radical acceptance of like, I'm not doing this because I have a timeline and an agenda for how long I'm going to do this so that they're no longer needing accommodations. Okay? So that is a difficult shift to make. So you might experiment with, I'm simply doing this to support the well-being of my child for as long as it takes, right? And that's going to feel scary because that's getting back to the idea of disability. And what I find is that as soon as parents start really radically accepting lowering demands as part of an accommodation for their child or teen, the energy starts to shift because the parent is no longer trying to control the outcome and the timeline and what it looks like, and sort of being in the position of authority of like, I'm going to lower these demands so that, and when they let go of that, guess what happens? The PDA teen or child is no longer neurocepting losses of autonomy and equality around the demand lowered. And things start to shift more, okay? So practicing an energy of non-attachment around lowering demands is the invitation that I want to give you today. The second thing to just be aware of is lowered demands, if we are always deciding them, can represent another example of parents being in a position of authority and deciding, right? And not actually giving autonomy around this. Because sometimes PDA children don't want lowered demands around things. They want to go out and do stuff. They just want it to be on their terms. So that's also why I define lowered demands as doing something physically for your PDA child or teen that they can do physically for themselves. And then focusing on autonomy around things like, are they coming to the grocery store with you? It's an offering, or like activities as an offering. So just reflect on like, is it possible that, I, in my type A personality and my perfectionism, and I'm speaking for myself because that's me, am I like, okay, I'm gonna lower demands, and then I like make a spreadsheet of all the lowered demands, and like I'm like, this is what we're doing. And then they sense the energy of like, oh, mom is putting herself above me and in the energy of the decider and the authority, and on a subconscious level I'm going to be perceiving threat around that, and then I'm going to be like, why aren't the lower demands shifting our relationship, right? Again, be aware. Be mindful, be demure. Okay, so finally, the lowering of demands, what I've seen from my bird's eye view in the PDA space and neurodivergent space, is often that like lower demands are looked at as a magic bullet or a fix, right? Or like the thing, like we're going to do lower demands and that's all we need to do. And what I want to emphasize is that lowering demands is a necessary but not sufficient condition for getting your child out of burnout, for example. What do I mean by that? It's super important. It's part of it. We need to do this, and it can sometimes distract us from the true root causes, which actually aren't demand avoidance. They are autonomy losses and equality losses that are neurocepted as threat, which can sometimes lead to avoidance. And sometimes they don't lead to avoidance at all. They lead to other things like equalizing behavior, where they're controlling and fixating on a sibling, right? And that's not avoidance. It's not demand avoidance. And so we want to be really careful about how we think about these things, because it really does matter the root cause of what's activating our kids' nervous systems. What actually is getting them to the point where they're stopping eating, where they can't go to school, right? And it's not necessarily demands, it's autonomy around what they're doing, right? And so I want you to feel into that logic as you're thinking about how to support your PDA child or teen. Okay? And so in this vein of lowering demands being necessary but not sufficient, there are 11 other accommodations that I teach on this page, in my programs, and in our new course, which is the upcoming Foundations course, which will begin on October 28th. It's a 2-week course, and I will teach both lowering demands and the 11 other accommodations, as well as 8 other skills that we can practice to get us to a place where we, A, don't hate our life, B, see our PDAers joining as the best version of themselves, and C, where we have a stable family. Okay, so that's what I want for you, and I want to invite you to that course. The enrollment begins on October 21st. Yes. Anyways, I'll put the details below. But it was very great to see you, and I will see you again soon. All right. Thanks for being here, everyone.